All eyes were fixed on the elderly woman standing with quiet, unshakable dignity before the judge's bench. Her back remained straight, her poise impeccable, her graceful hands resting gently on the polished oak podium. Behind her silver-rimmed glasses, her gaze was unwavering, clear, calm, and wise. Not defiant, not afraid, just patient. The kind of patience born from a lifetime of fighting for what's right. Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne leaned forward, a smug smile curving at the corners of his mouth. He savored these moments. The charged silence before the gavel fell, the weight of unchallenged authority pressing down like a storm about to break. "Mrs. Langston," he said, his voice ringing off the marble walls, cold and deliberate, "you are hereby fined $750 for disrupting these proceedings. This courtroom does not tolerate theatrics, regardless of your reputation." A ripple moved through the gallery. $750? For what? Sitting down quietly? Being late? Even those unfamiliar with her name felt the chill of injustice settle in, but no one spoke. Not here, not in Hawthorne's courtroom, where verdicts were swift, absolute, and steeped in contempt. Mrs. Langston didn't blink. She took a slow, deliberate breath and adjusted the scarf around her neck with graceful precision. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions." Hawthorne raised an eyebrow, mock surprise dripping from his expression. "A misunderstanding?" he echoed with a sneer. "You entered this courtroom after the hearing began and seated yourself without acknowledgement. Intentions are irrelevant. The law is not subjective." Mrs. Langston gave a gentle nod, as though she had expected nothing less. "I understand," she replied, almost too quietly. From her worn leather handbag, she retrieved a slim wallet and carefully counted out the bills, one by one, crisp, precise. $700, $100, $50. She laid them down like a silent challenge. The room held its breath. Judge Hawthorne leaned back, satisfied. "Next case." But a voice cut through the air. "Your Honor." It came from the back of the courtroom, steady, firm, unshaken. A young woman in a charcoal gray suit stood tall, her eyes locked on the bench. Her voice sliced through the silence. "I believe you should know who it is you just fined." The judge's smirk vanished. Mrs. Langston didn't turn. She stood motionless, composed, as murmurs spread like wildfire. Heads turned. Whispers grew louder. Who was she, and why did her name suddenly feel like a storm on the horizon? The answer, one the judge would soon regret overlooking, was about to upend everything he thought he controlled. Before we dive into this shocking mystery, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you love thrilling, jaw-dropping stories, don't forget to subscribe. The marble floors of the downtown Boston courthouse echoed with the steady, solitary click of low heels, each step deliberate, each one betraying nothing. Mrs. Professor Audrey Langston, cloaked in a long navy overcoat and a silk scarf tied just below her chin, moved through the imposing halls with the kind of quiet authority that made security guards instinctively step aside. She had not walked these halls in over a decade, not since her retirement from her post at Harvard Law, where her lectures on constitutional ethics were whispered about like scripture. Now she moved like a ghost returning to the scene of something unfinished, not from fear, but from necessity. She hadn't planned on stepping foot in a courtroom again, not as a witness, not as an observer, and certainly not as a defendant. But that morning had been different. A letter had arrived from a former student. Now, public defender Elena Warren had pleaded for her presence at a bail hearing that had spiraled into something darker. Audrey hadn't responded at first. She had long believed her chapter in the courtroom was closed. But something gnawed at her, something she hadn't felt in years. Unease. So she found herself at the courthouse entrance at 9:28 a.m., only to be stopped at a security checkpoint conducting an unscheduled emergency drill. By the time she cleared it and reached the courtroom doors, it was already 9:42. Inside, the proceedings had begun. Audrey slipped in quietly, trying not to draw attention, but this courtroom was one ruled by iron routines. And under the gavel of Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne, nothing went unnoticed. Tall, silver-haired, and immaculately dressed, Hawthorne was known for his stern demeanor, punctuated by an unnerving charm. He spotted Audrey immediately as she slid into a seat near the back. "Excuse me," Hawthorne said sharply, his voice slicing to the courtroom's low murmurs. "Are we now conducting open seating for tardy guests?" Audrey looked up calmly, her eyes locking onto his. They hadn't seen each other in over 15 years, not since he was a visiting lecturer during her tenure at Harvard. She remembered him as ambitious, aloof, prone to sharp logic, but lacking a moral compass. It seemed little had changed. "I apologize, Your Honor," she said, standing with measured grace. "I had a letter from the defense asking me to observe." You assumed wrong," he snapped. "This is not a theater, Professor Langston." The title hung in the air. Audible gasps flickered through the crowd. Whispers spiraled. Could it be Professor Langston? Juliet Carter, seated near the defense table, felt her heart stop. Audrey Langston, the woman who had shaped her legal conscience, the one who taught her that justice must walk hand in hand with empathy, was standing in her courtroom, being publicly reprimanded. "I see your reputation precedes you," Hawthorne said, offering a cold smile. "Still doesn't exempt you from courtroom decorum. I'll be issuing a citation. $750. Bailiff, please see to it." The bailiff, caught between awkward reverence and procedural duty, hesitated. Audrey's face did not flinch. She gave the briefest nod. "Of course." Hawthorne raised an eyebrow, almost disappointed by her lack of resistance. No rebuttal, Professor. No impassioned defense. Audrey turned toward him, her eyes steady as stone. "I'm not here to argue, Your Honor, but I will say this. Power doesn't give you the right to humiliate." The entire room stilled. You could hear the buzz of the ceiling lights. Hawthorne's jaw flexed. He leaned forward, his voice lowering to a simmer. "Then perhaps you should stay home next time." The bailiff handed her the citation, and she tucked it into her coat with the elegance of someone folding a dinner napkin. Juliet couldn't sit still. She waited until the hearing ended, then rushed into the hallway. Audrey was already on her way out, but her pace had slowed. Juliet caught up just before she reached the courthouse's grand front steps. "Professor Langston, wait." Audrey turned. Recognition flashed in her eyes. "Juliet Carter, I remember your closing arguments from your final seminar. Still the only student I've seen cite Thurgood Marshall with a throat full of tears and still win." Juliet smiled, caught off guard by the compliment, but her expression quickly hardened. "What just happened in there? He embarrassed you. That was personal." Audrey looked down at the folded citation in her hand. "It's more than that. He's testing limits, marking territory." Juliet nodded. "I think you're right. There have been rumors, odd case assignments, sealed files that don't make sense, defendants pushing to plead deals in chambers." Audrey's eyes sharpened. "Show me. Now." "No," Juliet said. "Tomorrow. Come to my house at 7. Bring coffee strong." The next morning, Juliet stood at the edge of a long oak table in Audrey's modest Beacon Hill home. Sprawled across its surface were old law texts, handwritten letters, and case transcripts Juliet had brought. Audrey, now in thick reading glasses and a burgundy cardigan, moved with purpose. With renewed energy, she flipped through the docket. "Hawthorne sentencing averages are double the state standard," she said. "His discretionary fines account for over 60% of the courthouse's annual budget. And look here, this fund." She tapped a line on a financial audit Juliet had obtained. "The Judicial Efficiency Reserve. Sounds noble, right?" Juliet nodded, cautious. "Follow the trail," Audrey continued. "The managing firm was founded 18 months ago. Its registered address is a P.O. box in Delaware, and its legal counsel," she pulled up a file on her old laptop, "Martin E. Dreesen, Hawthorne's college roommate, and incidentally, a name that appears in several sealed lawsuits filed by whistleblowers in other jurisdictions." Juliet sank into the chair beside her, overwhelmed. "I didn't realize it was this deep," she whispered. Audrey leaned back, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "That's because it's not just corruption. It's engineered obedience. A courtroom run like a kingdom. He finds the loudest, silences the weak, and preys on the ones without access to counsel. He's been constructing this for years. But why? Juliet asked. Power, Audrey said simply. And leverage. You fine someone $1,000 for a late parking ticket. They complain to a friend. You do it to 100 people a week, and you build a slush fund no one questions. But if we expose this, Audrey held up a hand. Not yet. You think he hasn't insulated himself? We need airtight proof. And we'll need someone inside. Someone who can access sealed court records. Someone who isn't afraid to lose everything. Juliet looked up. I know someone at ADH, Zachary Sterling. He studied under you too. He's been questioning things lately, quietly. Audrey nodded. Reach out, carefully. The moment he knows we're watching, he'll push back. That night, Juliet sat in her apartment, typing a carefully worded email to Zachary. She stared at the screen, then deleted it. No digital trail. She would call, or better, meet him in person. Outside, rain fell in rhythmic sheets against her window. But inside her, something else stirred. A sense of purpose, fire, and fear all rolled into one. The professor had woken up. The judge had drawn first blood. And Juliet knew, with unshakable certainty, that this was only the beginning. The cold morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows of Audrey Langston's study, casting long shadows across the room like prison bars. The scent of black coffee clung to the air, strong and bitter, as Juliet Carter sat across from Professor at the long oak table. Her posture was taut, her fingers dancing anxiously on the ceramic mug between her palms. Stacked around them were manila folders, USB drives, old law books, and printouts, case records, financial reports, judicial memos. The clutter was overwhelming, but every document had meaning. Every detail was a breadcrumb, leading them deeper into the dark underbelly of a courtroom no one had dared question, until now. Audrey, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, scanned the docket with surgical precision. Her expression was calm, almost clinical, but Juliet recognized a glint in her mentor's eyes. It wasn't just focus. It was fury, controlled, refined, and sharpened by years of restraint. This, Audrey murmured, tapping the docket, is not just about overreaching fines. Hawthorne's courtroom is running like a private enterprise. Juliet leaned forward. You think of the money laundering scheme? I think, Audrey said, sitting back slowly, we're looking at a finely tuned machine of judicial exploitation. Look here. See these payment patterns? Dozens of cases in the last 6 months. All minor infractions. All with excessive fines. Many of the defendants didn't even contest them. Why? Juliet asked, though she already knew. Because they couldn't afford a lawyer, Audrey replied. Or worse. They were pressured into plea deals. Juliet swallowed hard. And where does the money go? Audrey tapped another sheet. A municipal fund called the Judicial Efficiency Reserve. Sounds benign, but the firm managing it, Lexwell Strategies, is a phantom. No staff listings. No legal board. Its only traceable employee is a man named Garrett Vance. Juliet raised an eyebrow. That name sounds familiar. Audrey nodded grimly. It should. He was cited in a federal ethics investigation 5 years ago. The case went mysteriously cold. And here's the twist. Lexwell is headquartered out of a P.O. box in Delaware. A classic laundering tactic. Juliet sat back in her chair, a chill creeping up her spine. So what's the end game? He's skimming fines. Not just skimming, Audrey said. He's leveraging them. Fines fund the court's discretionary projects, renovations, outreach programs, even bonuses. But when the reserve becomes inflated beyond budget needs, that excess becomes invisible income, unregulated, untouchable, and who's really pocketing it? Juliet asked. Audrey gave a thin smile. That, my dear, is a question no one's had the spine to ask, until now. A knock at the door broke the tension. Audrey stood to answer it, her steps measured. On the other side was Zachary Sterling, assistant district attorney, wiry, sleep-deprived, and clutching a folder like it might burst into flames if he let it go. I wasn't followed, he said softly as he stepped inside, scanning the room like a man trained to expect traps. but I parked 3 blocks away, just in case. Juliet greeted him with a tight nod. You're sure no one at the DA's office knows? If they do, Zach said, closing the door behind him, I'm already dead meat. He placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were confidential memoranda, court communications, and several sealed files. One of them bore the watermark of the State Bar Oversight Committee. Hawthorne's been flagging high-profile defendants and funneling them into a private arbitration program, Zach explained. He claims it's for backlog mitigation. But that program doesn't exist, not officially. Audrey's eyes narrowed. So where do those defendants go? To mediation panels run by third-party firms, some of which happen to donate generously to judicial re-election campaigns. Juliet frowned. And the outcomes? Always the same, Zach said. Defendants pay settlements instead of facing trial, and the settlements bypass the public record. Quiet, quick, clean. Audrey's jaw tightened. How long has this been going on? Too long, Zach admitted. But no one touches it because Hawthorne is protected. He has connections. State officials, donors, judges on the ethics board. He's untouchable. Until now, Audrey said. But even as the words left her mouth, a cold certainty settled in her bones. This wasn't just a rogue judge lining his pockets. This was systemic, engineered, a machine built to crush and consume, designed by someone with vision, and funded by people who had more to gain from silence than from justice. Juliet pulled out a flash drive. There's more. I've been working with an analyst. He flagged several sealed case files that were manually redacted. In one, the defendant was a single mother ticketed for expired registration. She was fined $1,200 and couldn't pay. The court assigned her to community service, but the firm overseeing it billed her directly, then issued a warrant when she missed a shift. Zach's face darkened. So the system finds you, charges you work it off, and jails you if you can't? Juliet nodded. Modern-day debtor's prison. Audrey sat still for a long moment, letting the weight of it press down on the room. Then she rose, walked to her bookshelf, and pulled out a worn hardcover volume, Justice and Equilibrium, Ethics in Modern Law. Her own book. I wrote this 20 years ago, she said softly. I believed then that the law, if interpreted through empathy and fairness, could be a moral compass. But men like Hawthorne twist it. They turn the law into a scalpel, carving out power while everyone else bleeds. She opened the book and slid a thin sheet of paper from inside, a handwritten list. Names, dates, notes. What's that? Juliet asked. A shadow network, Audrey said. I've tracked judges, attorneys, and lobbyists connected to judicial misconduct for years. Most of it was circumstantial, until now. Hawthorne's name connects half of them. Financial records, campaign contributions, mutual affiliations. I just didn't have the smoking gun. Zach tapped the folder he brought. You do now. Just then, the house phone rang. Audrey looked at it, then at the others. No one had that number. Not anymore. She answered. A male voice, flat and emotionless, spoke. Stop digging, Professor, or we'll bury you where the law can't find you. The line went dead. Audrey stood motionless for a beat, then slowly hung up the phone. She turned back to the others, her voice low and steely. They're watching us. Juliet's hand clenched into a fist. Then she let it go. Then let them watch. We're not stopping. Zach nodded. We need to leak this, but carefully. We can't just go to the media. It'll get spun or buried. We need leverage. I have an idea, Audrey said, but it'll require a risk, a public one. Juliet tilted her head. How public? Audrey met her gaze. We file a judicial complaint. Officially, on the record, and we do it with full documentation. That forces a preliminary hearing and puts Hawthorne's name on every legal desk in the state within 48 hours. Zach's eyes widened. That'll make us targets. Audrey nodded. Yes, but it will also flush out whoever is protecting him. We're no longer just investigating. We're declaring war. Juliet looked at the table. The files, the evidence, the lives torn apart. Then she whispered, Then let's start the fire. Audrey smiled faintly. Good, because it's time the law remembered who it was meant to serve. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Boston skyline. Inside that quiet brownstone, 3 legal minds drew their battle lines, ready to dismantle a machine built on fear, silence, and greed. And somewhere across the city, in an office with tinted windows and a view that touched the clouds, a man closed a file labeled Langston. He picked up a secure line. "She's coming for him," he said. A long silence on the other end, then a chilling reply. "Then make sure she doesn't get far." The complaint was filed on a Tuesday morning, signed in ink by Professor Audrey Langston, Attorney Juliet Carter, and ADA Zachary Sterling. By noon, it had reached the State Judicial Review Board, and by evening, a digital copy of the document had been deliberately leaked to 3 trusted independent journalists. The title of the document was as plain as it was provocative: Preliminary Findings on Judicial Misconduct, Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne within hours. It was trending across legal forums, news blogs, and the corners of the internet where truth burned hotter than censorship. Whispers turned into waves. An echo began reverberating across courthouses and government offices alike. The very name Hawthorne, once cloaked in fear, was now stained with scrutiny. For the first time in years, his courtroom sat half empty the following morning. But Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne did not flinch. He sat taller in his chair, his jaw set tighter, his tone colder. If anyone noticed a tension in the courtroom's air, the flicker of doubt in the eyes of clerks and bailiffs, they dared not speak it aloud, not in his presence. When his gavel struck with that morning, it sounded less like justice and more like defiance. Across the city, inside Audrey's Beacon Hill brownstone, the mood was anything but victorious. The filing had triggered the first move, but they all knew retaliation wouldn't take long. Audrey sat in her study, her scarf pulled tighter around her neck, staring into the fire as if searching for answers. Juliet paced by the windows, checking her phone every few minutes. Zachary sat near the mantel, typing rapidly into an encrypted laptop, trying to download everything onto 3 separate drives. "We've made noise," Audrey said finally, her voice distant. "Now comes the avalanche." She was right. By midnight, their inboxes were flooded. Anonymous threats, legal inquiries, cryptic warnings. A video was posted. Online, grainy and clearly manipulated, purporting to show Zach accepting a bribe years ago. A day later, an article surfaced on a fringe website, claiming Juliet had doctor case files. Then, without warning, Audrey's bank account was frozen. "I've had that account for 28 years, she said flatly, holding the rejection receipt from the bank like a piece of evidence. No calls, no warning, just locked. Juliet's face turned pale. "They're not just trying to discredit us. They're isolating us." Zach slammed his laptop shut. "I've seen this before. It's a playbook. First, they sever your access. Then they spin your identity. And then they come after your safety." They all knew what he meant. This wasn't just about Hawthorne. It was bigger, much bigger. Someone with reach, someone with power, was pulling the strings. Reach, coordinated, calculated, and deliberate, was pulling the strings now. The shadow conspirators had stepped out of the darkness and into motion. That evening, a knock at the door changed everything. Audrey opened it to find a trembling young woman, no more than 24, standing on the porch with wide eyes and a voice shaking with urgency. "You don't know me," she said quickly, "but I saw the news. My brother, he's one of Hawthorne's sealed cases. He was forced into a plea deal for something he didn't do. I tried to talk to a lawyer once, and the next day, someone followed me home." Audrey stepped aside and ushered her in without a word. Her instincts told her this girl was real. The fear in her voice was not staged. It was lived. The young woman's name was Rena Ortiz, and she handed him a thumb drive wrapped tightly in electrical tape. "I stole it," she said quietly. "My brother's public defender left it in a drawer. He didn't think I'd know what it was. But I work in IT at a tech school. I cracked it." Zach plugged it in. Within minutes, they had access to dozens of sealed court transcripts, many with Hawthorne's name digitally erased, but all bearing his unmistakable signature. Juliet gasped as she read through one. This defendant She was convicted on a technicality. The original file shows conflicting witness statements. The redacted version has them cleaned up, aligned. Zach's eyes narrowed. He altered evidence. Or someone did it for him. And then, bam, the lights in the house flickered. Then darkness. Juliet's heart slammed into her ribs. She backed away from the window, instinctively reaching for her phone. No signal. Zach moved to the breaker panel, only to find it locked, padlocked from the inside. "We have to move," Audrey said with terrifying calm. "They're here." The front door burst open before she could finish her sentence, splintering on its hinges as two men in black stepped into the foyer, flashlights mounted to their rifles. Juliet grabbed the laptop. Zach tucked the drive into his coat. Audrey reached behind the bookshelf and opened a hidden side door, a tunnel sheet had built years ago after receiving one too many threats during her time on the ethics board. The tunnel led to an alley, dark and soaked from rain. They emerged into the silence of Boston's midnight chill, hearts pounding, lungs burning. But the quiet didn't last. A car engine roared to life. Headlights snapped on. "They found us," Zach hissed. Juliet darted to the right. This way, train tunnels. They raced through narrow alleys, slipping through fences, cutting across construction zones until they found a hidden freight tunnel entrance beneath an old stone overpass. Inside it was cold, damp, and pitch black. Only the faint glow of Audrey's wristwatch guided them deeper. They stopped after 20 minutes of silence. Zach pulled out his phone. Still dead. Audrey looked at him. "We're not just targets. We're threats to an entire operation." Juliet, panting, added, "If we die now, no one will know the truth." Zach's face hardened. "Not if I can help it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a second flash drive. "The drive Raina gave us. I made a backup." Audrey smiled faintly in the dark. "You're learning." They made their way to an old safe house owned by a retired journalist friend of Audrey's, someone she once saved from a wrongful defamation lawsuit decades earlier. It was small, dusty, but secure. They compiled everything. The sealed transcripts, the altered plea bargains, the flow of money through Lexwell Strategies, the campaign donations tied arbitration firms, and most revealing of all, the quiet fingerprints of one name that appeared at the edges of every file, every transfer, every silence whistleblower. Martin Dry's son, a former classmate of Hawthorne, a behind-the-scenes power broker, a man who now ran a consulting firm tied to the Efficiency Reserve Fund. The moment his name surfaced, everything clicked into place. He wasn't just involved in the scheme. He was the architect. And worse, his name was tied to judicial appointments, political endorsements, and corporate lobbying efforts in 3 different states. They had stumbled onto a network of corruption far bigger than one courthouse. Audrey stared at the web of documents before them. She knew what had to be done. "We go public," she said. "Not just about Hawthorne, about all of it. And this time, the world would be watching." "Public," she said, "but not with one outlet. We go wide. We drop everything at once. Multiple reporters, multiple platforms, legal observers, watchdog groups. If they want to silence us, they'll have to silence 100 voices." "But how?" Juliet asked. "We don't have devices. No servers. No connections left." Audrey gave a sly smile. "We don't, but I know someone who does." The next morning, under cover of dawn, they traveled to Cambridge, where Audrey's former protege, Mara Nwan, a prominent digital civil rights activist, worked from a private studio fortified with top-tier cybersecurity systems. They gave her the files. She read them in stunned silence. This is a nuclear bomb," she whispered. Audrey nodded, then light the fuse. Within 12 hours, the information was released simultaneously across 37 platforms, each with a unique download path and independently written summary analysis. An interactive timeline traced the corruption from Hawthorne's courtroom to Drayson's network. Whistleblower interviews were embedded. Redacted files were cross-referenced with unsealed data. The public could see everything. The headlines exploded. Corruption in black robes. Hawthorne's court exposed. The Langston Files. A legal reckoning. Dark justice. When judges profit from a guilty, Hawthorne's name was everywhere. So was Audrey's. So was Juliet's. So was Zach's. They had turned themselves into lightning rods, and the storm was coming. Back in his office, Judge Hawthorne stood frozen, watching the broadcast in silence as images of sealed documents and courtroom victims filled the screen. His phone rang. He didn't answer. It rang again. The second time, he picked up. "You failed to stop them," said the voice on the other end. Hawthorne swallowed hard. They were supposed to be ghosts by now. "No," the voice replied coldly. "You were." Then the line went dead. And so Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne, once a symbol of absolute power in his courtroom, now realized what it truly meant to lose control. And somewhere in the shadows, the man who had once helped crown him king began drafting a new plan. If Langston wouldn't stop, then she'd have to be stopped for good. It was the most watched hearing in the state's judicial history. Outside the courthouse, a sea of reporters, protesters, and federal observers crowded the steps. Camera crews jostled for space behind yellow barricades. News anchors spoke breathlessly into microphones, narrating the fall of a once unassailable legal giant. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, not just from the weight of the case, but from the presence of Professor Audrey Langston, standing at the center of the storm she never intended to ignite. The courtroom had changed. No longer Hawthorne's fiefdom. No longer his theater of intimidation. On this day, Judge Marion Castor, a federal appointee known for her no-nonsense demeanor and razor-sharp intellect, presided from the bench. Her presence exuded a different kind of authority, one built on balance rather than fear. Still, no one in the room could ignore the irony. This hearing, this reckoning, was unfolding in the very courtroom where Hawthorne had humiliated Audrey just months earlier. Now the podium she stood behind belonged to her. Audrey's frame was dignified, her presence grounded. Though in her 70s, she carried the fire of her convictions with the precision of a scalpel. Her gray scarf was neatly tied. Her glasses caught the light as she gazed calmly at the packed gallery. Juliet Carter sat behind her, flanked by Zachary Sterling, both tense, alert, ready. The proceeding wasn't a trial, not yet. It was an evidentiary hearing, one that would determine whether Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne would be suspended, indicted, or allowed to remain on the bench. But the public knew what this truly was. A battle between truth and power, fought under oath, recorded and televised. And Hawthorne, seated at the defense table in a dark suit, his face drawn but still carrying the remnants of defiance, understood that too. "Professor Langston," Judge Castor began. "You may proceed." Audrey stepped forward, voice steady and sure. "Your Honor, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a hearing about corruption. This is a hearing about erosion, the erosion of trust, of judicial integrity, and of the very laws meant to protect the vulnerable from the powerful." She paused, letting her words settle into the silence. For years, Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne has exploited the authority of this court to amass power, silence dissent, and redirect justice to serve private interests. He did not merely break rules. He rewrote them in the shadows, hidden beneath a facade of formality and process. At the defense table, Hawthorne's attorney, a slick, fast-talking man named Greg Talbot, rose to object. "Your Honor, this sounds like an opening argument to a jury trial. This is a procedural hearing." Judge Castor raised a hand. "She's laying the foundation." "Continue, Professor." Audrey gave a polite nod. "I intend to show, through verified documentation and first-hand witness testimony, that Judge Hawthorne orchestrated and benefited from a system of legal abuse, financial laundering, and retaliatory practices. And when exposed, he and those allied with him attempted to destroy anyone who dared speak the truth." She turned, gesturing toward Juliet and Zach. "Attorney Juliet Carter will present the redacted case files and forensic audit results. ADA Zachary Sterling will testify to the internal suppression of misconduct reports. And I," she said, locking eyes with Hawthorne, "will provide both personal testimony and evidence tracing the web of connections from this courtroom to a network of financial beneficiaries, including Mr. Martin Drayson and the now-defunct Lexwell Strategies." A murmur spread through the gallery. The name Drayson had become synonymous with deep-rooted corruption. The man had vanished from public view weeks earlier, just as the scandal broke. Some believed he had fled the country. Others whispered he'd been silenced. Juliet stood and approached the bench, laptop in hand. Her screen mirrored onto the courtroom's projector. "Your Honor, Exhibit A," she began, clicking to open a sealed court file. "This transcript, previously redacted, contains original witness statements in the case of State versus Carmela Ruiz." She clicked again, revealing the altered version. The altered file, which was submitted to court by Judge Hawthorne's chambers, omits two key contradictions in testimony, effectively removing all reasonable doubt. The screen split, showing the two versions side by side. Audible gasps rippled through the courtroom. "And this isn't an isolated case," Julia continued. "We found 17 others, all with discrepancies, all with redactions that conveniently removed defense-friendly facts." Talbot stood again. "Objection, Your Honor. We haven't had a chance to review these files for authenticity." Judge Castor turned to Zach. "Mr. Sterling, were these files independently verified?" Zach rose, holding up a sworn affidavit. "Yes, Your Honor. Verified by the Office of Digital Forensics under the Attorney General's oversight. The hash timestamps confirm the documents were manipulated post-filing and not by court clerks, but via external login credentials tied to Judge Hawthorne's administrative account." Judge Castor narrowed her eyes. "Thank you. Objection overruled." Talbot sat down, visibly rattled. Juliet moved to the next file. This one displayed financial records, significant transfers from a judicial efficiency reserve to shell companies disguised as vendors. "Exhibit B," she said. "This details how discretionary fines were routed through fake accounts, many of which trace back to firms owned or managed by close associates of Judge Hawthorne, including, Your Honor, his own brother-in-law." The courtroom was no longer still. A hum of shock and disbelief rippled outward. Audrey stepped forward again. "But perhaps more concerning than the financial misdeeds," she said, "are the retaliatory efforts employed when we attempted to uncover them." The lights dimmed briefly, a flicker. Everyone tensed. Juliet's face paled. Zach leaned over and whispered, "They're still trying to intimidate us." Audrey didn't blink. "Let it flicker," she whispered back. "We'll keep the light on." She pulled a letter from her case folder, a threat she received 3 weeks earlier, typed in cold block letters. "Stay silent, or we'll bury you in brick and law." "We've received threats, Your Honor," she said, voice unwavering. "And had. Our homes were invaded, our bank accounts frozen, our professional reputation smeared. I was arrested, falsely charged, and detained for financial fraud. Charges that coincidentally mirrored an ongoing investigation Judge Hawthorne had initiated the year before." She handed the court clerk a sealed envelope. "Inside is an affidavit from a former clerk, who now lives in protective custody," she stated. "He confirms that Judge Hawthorne uses influence to engineer false charges against anyone he perceived as a threat, including myself." Judge Castor examined the envelope, her face unreadable. Greg Talbot stood one last time, desperation leaking through his calm veneer. "Your Honor, all of this is hearsay. Smoke and theater. My client has dedicated his life to the bench. These accusations, these theatrics, are an attack on the very idea of judicial impartiality." Judge Castor looked down from the bench, her tone ironclad. "No, Mr. Talbot, this is not an attack on impartiality. It is a defense of it." Hawthorne's jaw twitched. His eyes locked on Audrey's, cold, bitter, and wounded. Finally, he rose. "Without permission, without introduction. I demand to speak," he said. His voice cracked, not with humility but with rage. The courtroom held its breath. "I have done what any judge in the city has done," he began, voice rising. "Enforce the law, balance the budget, manage a failing system with dwindling resources. And yes, cut corners when necessary, because this city doesn't care about justice. It cares about results. And results require sacrifice." Juliet rose behind Audrey, her voice slicing through the room like a blade. "No, Judge Hawthorne. Results don't require the truth to be murdered." The room fell into stunned silence. Hawthorne turned to her, eyes blazing. You think you've won, he spat. You think you've exposed some grand conspiracy? You expose nothing but politics. You have no idea who you're really fighting. I wasn't working alone. I was... Enough? Judge Castor barked. Sit down. But the room had already absorbed what he said. I wasn't working alone. The implications thundered. Judge Castor called a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, stunned faces drifting into the halls. Reporters dashed call in their updates. Security tripled in the antechamber. Audrey sat quietly, sipping water. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of truth finally spoken. Zach leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He cracked, on record. Juliet exhaled, and he confirmed what we suspected. There's someone bigger behind him. Audrey nodded. Then we followed the echo. From a distance, high above the city in a black glass tower overlooking Boston's skyline, a man watched a hearing unfold across 5 silent screens. He stood perfectly still, expression flat, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Prepare phase 2, he said. Langston just opened the door. He added coldly, let's see how far she's willing to walk through it. The courtroom smelled different the day the verdict came down. Not of paper and wood polish, but of tension. Raw, humid. It clung to the air like pre-storm fog. Thick with anticipation. Thick with the weight of justice trying to assert itself against the wreckage of lies. The gallery was packed. Reporters, law clerks, students, former defendants, victims of the system, allies who had once been too afraid to speak, and those who had come simply to witness history write a new sentence. All eyes were on the once mighty Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne, seated now not in a place of power, but at the defense table, unrobed, stripped of the ceremonial pretense he had so long weaponized. He wore the same Navy suit he had during his rise. But now, it looked like armor that no longer fit. His face was pale, jaw clenched, lips drawn into a thin, bitter slash. For a man who had once made others tremble, Hawthorne now looked impossibly small. His hands, one steady on the gavel, now gripped the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright, because, in a way, it was... Across from him stood Professor Audrey Langston, dignified in gray, a single silver pin at her collar. The scales of justice tilted ever so slightly. She did not sit. She remained standing, even after her testimony. Her frame was worn, but unbending. She had not come for vengeance. She had come to finish something much larger. An idea, a reckoning, a restoration, an unfinished lesson, decades in the making. Behind her sat Juliet Carter, eyes locked on the judge, steel behind glass. Beside her was Zachary Sterling, his suit rumpled from sleepless nights, eyes bloodshot but alert. They walked through fire together, watched the walls close in, lost friends, endured threats, and even dodged death itself. But they had survived, and in doing so, they cracked the shell of the system long thought impenetrable. The lead federal prosecutor, a woman with ice in her voice and a resume that made lobbyists tremble, approached the bench. Her name was Camille Dorn, and she wasted no time. Your Honor, she said to Judge Regina Alston, who presided over the criminal trial, the people rest their case. Judge Alston, composed and clear-eyed, nodded slowly. The court acknowledges the closing statements. This matter is now in the hands of the jury. No one exhaled as the 12 jurors filed out. No one dared. And when they returned, hours later, with eyes like sealed vaults and expressions unreadable, the silence was excruciating. The clerk stood, her voice quivering slightly beneath the weight of the moment. In the matter of United States versus Nathaniel Hawthorne, she read, on the charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, bribery, falsification of court records, and judicial misconduct, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Gasps rippled through the room. Some hands flew to mouths. Others clasped tightly in disbelief. In the back, a single woman began to cry. Not from grief, but from a kind of relief so deep it could only come after years of being ignored. Nathaniel Hawthorne did not flinch, but Audrey saw it, the smallest shift. His right hand twitched. His eyes didn't blink. His jaw clenched, too tight, as if holding back something primal. He didn't protest, didn't speak. It was over. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Judge Alston's voice rang clear. Sentencing to be scheduled within 30 days. The defendant is to be taken into custody immediately. The courtroom erupted. A mix of cheers and stunned murmurs. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled for the exits to file their breaking stories. Audrey remained still, watching, waiting, and then she saw it, Hawthorne rising slowly, almost reluctantly. Before the officers approached, he turned his head, eyes scanning the room. For a fleeting second, his gaze locked onto hers, and he smiled. It wasn't smug. It wasn't cruel. It was something far more chilling. It was knowing, like a man who had already set something in motion, even as he fell. They cuffed him, led him past her. He didn't say a word, but the message was unmistakable in his silence. This part is done, but the game isn't over. Outside, the courthouse steps were chaos. Protesters, supporters, press, citizens who had once feared the system now chanted Audrey's name like a rallying cry. Flashbulbs exploded. Microphones crowded around her, begging for a quote. She gave one, and only one. Justice is not a single verdict. It's a journey. And today, we took one step forward. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Hawthorne falls. Power meets judgment. Langston leads courtroom revolution. Inside the trial that shook the system. But behind the victory, beneath the noise, a darker current stirred. At a quiet federal office in D.C., Camille Dorn reviewed files with grim determination. New subpoenas were being drafted because Hawthorne, it turned out, had not acted alone. Names were surfacing. Corporations, consultants, former prosecutors, shell companies. And at the center of this intricate web, Martin Drayson. Still missing. Still dangerous. Juliet sat in her apartment, staring at a manila envelope left on her doorstep the night before. No return address. Inside, one photo. A surveillance image of her and Audrey leaving a cafe. On the back, a single sentence. The tree still grows. 2 hours later, Zach called. They hit one of the witnesses, Reyna Ortiz. She's gone. No trace. Her apartment was wiped clean. Juliet felt the chill creep down her spine. Their cleaning house. Which means we're next, Zach said quietly. They're not just retaliating anymore. They're preparing for a counterattack. Meanwhile, Audrey Langston received a private invitation to speak. Before a special ethics committee formed in the wake of the trial, Audrey was invited to testify. But she understood what it truly was. A test, a distraction, a way to place her on a pedestal while others tried to slip through the cracks unnoticed. So she declined, politely, firmly. Instead, she chose a different audience. A week later, she stood before a packed auditorium of young legal scholars, activists, and public defenders. She didn't lecture. She told a story. A story of how silence becomes complicity. Of how a single courtroom humiliation became a national reckoning. Of how power does not fall unless someone is willing to stand. And as she finished, her voice low and unwavering, she said, I didn't do this alone. I didn't want to do this at all. But there comes a moment in every fight when you realize that no one is coming to fix it except you. That moment is a beginning, not an end. The crowd didn't applaud. They stood in solidarity. In the weeks that followed, state bar associations opened investigations into other judges. A dozen courtrooms came under audit. Several convictions were overturned. And a national commission was launched to examine the systemic abuse of judicial discretion. They called it the Langston Report. And yet, Audrey still checked over her shoulder at night. Juliet changed apartments. Zach began traveling with security because justice had teeth, but so did those who had lost it. Then came the anonymous package left at Audrey's doorstep. Inside were financial documents, sealed testimonies, and the names of 3 judges in neighboring states with direct links to Drayson. It wasn't a threat. It was a map, a continuation, and Audrey knew immediately who had sent it. Not an enemy, a ghost, someone within the machine, leaking from the inside. Juliet read through the documents, her eyes wide. This is enough to open 3 federal investigations. Zach nodded. And enough to make us targets all over again. Audrey stared at the files, at the possibility, at the risk. Then she stood. Then we begin again. Juliet hesitated. Are you sure? After everything? Audrey's voice was soft. Justice doesn't rest. So neither can we. And just like that, the reckoning gave way to resolve. The system had bent, cracked, revealed its bleeding underbelly to the world. But the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The morning after sentencing, Boston felt different. Not quieter, not calmer, but awake. Something had shifted, not just in courtrooms and legal offices, but in coffee shops, in city squares, in classrooms, in neighborhoods that had for too long accepted injustice as inevitable. Now, they buzz with a new kind of electricity, belief. And yet, in the early dawn haze, Professor Audrey Langston sat alone on a worn wooden bench in Boston Commons, a scarf draped around her shoulders. Her breath fogged the crisp March air. In her hands, she held a folded letter, unopened. It had arrived at her door without a return address, like so many others had during the long months of chaos. But something about this one felt different. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't political. It was personal. She hadn't opened it yet, not because she feared what it might say, but because deep in her gut, she knew what it would ask of her, to keep going. The past few weeks had brought triumphs the world once deemed impossible. Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne, the symbol of unchecked authority, was behind bars. Dozens of cases had been reopened, wrongful convictions overturned. Whistleblowers had emerged from the shadows, no longer alone. Juliet Carter had become the face of a new generation of attorneys. Zachary Sterling, the backbone of a growing coalition for judicial reform. Their names appeared in newspapers, on talk shows, in lecture halls across the country. The Langston Report was printed, dissected, quoted in legal journals nationwide. But Audrey knew the truth beneath it all. Justice had been served, but the system had not yet healed. Across the city, in a quiet federal archive room, agents scanned thousands of sealed case files, some so old they had to be handled with gloves. They followed the money, the case patterns, the names that kept appearing. Many of those names were familiar. Judges, consultants, even a sitting senator. And behind them, always at the edge of the frame, like a ghost, watching, waiting, the signature of Martin Drayson. He had vanished completely. No sightings, no digital footprint. His firm, Lexwell Strategies, had been dissolved overnight, its accounts wiped clean. Some speculated he was dead. Others whispered he had simply stepped deeper into the shadows, out of reach, but never out of play. And that was the truth that haunted Audrey most, because she had felt his presence long before the trial ever began, long before Hawthorne's arrogance became his noose. Drayson had been a hand behind the curtain, the architect of an empire built on compliance and fear. And she knew, deep in her bones, that men like him did not vanish. They reorganized. At her feet, a newspaper fluttered in the wind. She glanced down. A headline caught her eye. Senator Warren steps down amid ethics probe. Ties to judicial pay-to-play scheme alleged. One root pulled, another exposed. But the tree remained. She finally opened the letter. It was brief. What you started cannot be stopped, but it can be redirected. Choose your next move wisely, Professor. Some fires illuminate, others consume. No signature, no seal, but she recognized the language, elegant, calculated, and unmistakably Drayson. She folded the letter and slipped it into her coat, her expression unreadable. That afternoon, she met Juliet and Zach in a quiet cafe tucked between 2 brownstones. The world outside was loud with celebration. Inside, they were planning. They want to fund an institute, Juliet said, sipping her coffee. Named after you. Scholarships, policy research, ethics, law reform, Zach added. Federal grants are coming in. Civil rights foundations. Even the Bar Association wants your endorsement for a national oversight board. Audrey stirred her tea. And how many of those people stayed silent while Hawthorne reigned? She asked softly. Neither answered. She sighed. We don't need monuments. We need sentinels. People watching from the inside, pushing back, preventing the next Hawthorne before the first gavel falls. Juliet nodded. That's what the initiative is for. They had spent weeks shaping it. A non-profit watchdog organization rooted in law, technology, journalism, and policy. The Langston Initiative would be more than a think tank. It would be a weapon. One powered not by politics, but by truth. Still, Zach said quietly, if we launch this, we paint targets on our backs. Again, Audrey replied, meeting his gaze. Then we make sure we're harder to hit. She reached into her coat and pulled out a second letter. This one marked with the Department of Justice seal. They're forming a coalition task force, she said. Multi-state investigations. They want us to consult. They know more names are coming. Juliet's eyes widened. It's starting. No, Audrey corrected. It's continuing. Outside the cafe, two teenagers walked past, earbuds in, heads down. One wore a hoodie that made Juliet blink. Printed across the back, justice isn't given. It's demanded. Below it, in smaller text, Langston Initiative 2025. Word had spread faster than they imagined. Later that night, Audrey stood alone on her apartment balcony, staring at the skyline. Somewhere out there, in an office or a bunker or a yacht or a conference room, men like Drayson were recalculating, repositioning. Power didn't disappear. It rebranded. But now, they knew she was watching. Her phone buzzed. A message from an encrypted number. They're moving in New York. Judicial appointments being arranged. You'll need eyes on the ground. She replied without hesitation, already in motion. Then she turned off her phone and stepped back inside. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in years, she wasn't fighting alone. In courthouses, universities, legislative halls, and even in the streets, something had taken root. Not just outrage, not just resistance, but resolve. A belief that the law could be more than a cage, that it could become a shield, a sword, a truth teller. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth building ever is. And as Audrey Langston placed her coat on its hook and pulled the files for the next case into her hands, she smiled to herself, softly, barely there, like a quiet sunrise before a storm. Because this wasn't the end of the story. This was the beginning of something bigger. In today's world, where systems of power often operate behind closed doors and justice can feel distant or distorted, the story of Professor Audrey Langston reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing is not neutrality. It's complicity. Like many real-world examples of institutional corruption, this narrative reveals how those entrusted with upholding the law can weaponize it for personal gain, silencing dissent through intimidation, bureaucracy, and fear. Yet it also offers something profoundly hopeful, that truth, when spoken with courage, can fracture even the most fortified walls. Audrey's quiet resistance, Juliet's tenacity, and Zachary's moral awakening reflect what our society desperately needs. Ordinary people stepping up to hold power accountable. The lesson is clear. Transparency, vigilance, and collective action are essential to preserving justice. Whether you're a lawyer, student, journalist, or citizen, you have a role. Ask hard questions. Refuse to look away. Because change doesn't come from waiting for heroes. It comes from becoming one, even in small, defiant steps. When people like Audrey Langston speak out, they don't just expose corruption. They inspire belief that justice isn't just an idea. It's a fight, and it's worth it. Thanks for watching. If you found this story meaningful, comment 1 and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.